Michael Douglas won 5 Golden Globes and 2 Academy Awards, a career that changed Hollywood twice over the course of more than 50 years. First, from behind the camera, creating the movie that won multiple Oscars and revolutionized the film industry. And then in front of it, Gordon Gekko, a single, indelible name that personified the brutal ambition of an entire age. Both on and off screen, he created empires. He transformed unvarnished, morally complex tales into cultural icons that are still studied, quoted, and feared by future generations. The world was given a mirror by the man who said that greed is good. It has never ceased investigating. However, there is a tragic rather than spectacular tale hidden behind that heritage. A illness that almost permanently silenced him was the subject of a covert war conducted simultaneously on 4 fronts: against a son lost to prison and drugs, against a marriage that is collapsing because to celebrity, and against the oppressive shadow of a father so legendary that it seemed impossible to break free. Few people are ready to confront the eerie cost Michael Douglas paid for each prize, standing ovation, and moment of cinematic genius, despite the fact that the world has been celebrating him for decades. A price paid in hospital rooms, jail visits, and nights of pain too great for any limelight to erase, rather than in monetary terms. As a tribute to a man who gave the world his best performances while silently enduring the performance of survival. Please leave a like if any of Michael Douglas's films have ever made you feel the energy of true cinema. When a tale is based on longing rather than privilege, it is devastating. When the child of Hollywood royalty feels invisible inside the very kingdom his father founded. On September 25, 1944, Michael Kirk Douglas was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey. His father, Isur Daniel, had changed into Kirk Douglas, one of the most captivating and physically dominant actors Hollywood had ever produced. He was born into a family name that was already becoming legendary. By the time Michael was old enough to comprehend what a movie theater was, his father's fierce, jaw-set, and enormous face was already filling its screens in a way that no child could ever hope to match just by sharing a home. The home itself was cracking, though. When Michael's parents split in 1951, he was 6 years old. At this age, a kid cannot yet express the shape of loss. Instead, they fully absorb it. He moved to Connecticut to live with his mother, Diana Dill, a modest, elegant Bermudian actress. Kirk Douglas persisted in his unrelenting rise through Hollywood, traveling sets, landing parts, and developing the kind of notoriety that engulfed everything in its path, including the routine rhythms of fatherhood. On holidays, Michael spent time with his father. The tale belonged to everyone else for the remainder of the year. Michael went to the Eaglebrook School in Deerfield, Massachusetts, in Connecticut, where he was surrounded by rules, athletics, and expectations. The son of a movie star might have been an excellent student, but he wasn't. He carried a silent need that the classroom failed to satisfy, and he was restless and preoccupied by something he could not yet identify. The restlessness only got worse when he was relocated to the esteemed Connecticut boarding school Chott Rosemary Hall. He started discussing acting. His father's answer was clear-cut and quick. Born to illiterate Russian Jewish immigrants and lived in poverty in Amsterdam, New York, Kirk Douglas had no desire to see his son take advantage of the family name. He told Michael straight out that he wanted something more dependable for his boys, that the profession was full of pain, and that most ambitions died there. Michael's rejection from the guy he most desired for acceptance turned into a defining wound. He would later acknowledge that he had spent a significant portion of his early years attempting to discover his identity outside of the term son, using the cautious language of a man who had spent decades processing the bruise. Michael, not the youngster from the well-known family, nor Kirk's son. However, you don't choose your identity when you're 20. The world assigns it. Michael Douglas's identity had already been established by the Globe. And aside in the tale of his father, something started to change when he enrolled at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Michael found that acting was more than just what his family did when he got away from the shadow of Connecticut boarding schools and the critical eyes of a legendary father. He needed it. He was genuinely hungry to learn about drama, discovered mentors who viewed him as a young man with his own presence, timing, and fire, rather than as Kirk's son. In 1968, he graduated with the serene assurance of someone who had at last discovered the one cause worth pursuing. His early career was anything from regal television work, small parts, and the tedious anonymity of a young actor establishing himself on his own terms. In 1969, he landed his first major role in the tiny anti-war movie Hail Hero, which won him a Golden Globe nomination for New Star of the Year, but barely altered his reputation in Hollywood. When the industry saw Kirk's name, they thought of him. Kirk's looks caught the attention of the reviewers. Michael was professional on set, kind in interviews, and secretly worn out by the comparisons that followed him everywhere. The streets of San Francisco followed. Michael Douglas played Inspector Steve Keller opposite Carl Malden in one of America's most popular crime series for 5 years, starting in 1972. It wasn't glamorous. Week after week of arduous television production, long hours, physical demands, and the particular discipline of a performer who shows up and delivers regardless of mood or situation were all part of the experience. He received recognition for the show. Most significantly, it taught him something Kirk had never sat down to teach, and it gained him a following. That long-term success in this field does not require genius. It has to do with endurance. However, Michael Douglas was already creating something much more important than another acting credit as viewers began to identify him on television. Something that would not only carry on his father's legacy, but also establish a completely original one from behind the camera with a plot so challenging that every Hollywood studio had already rejected it. The story was not passed on to him. He battled for it. His father had been fixated on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest for more than 10 years. For $47,000, Kirk Douglas bought the rights to Ken Kesey's 1962 book, spent years trying to persuade Hollywood that the dark, rebellious tale of a man who fakes insanity to escape a prison farm deserved to be on cinema. He starred in the Broadway production in 1963. Studios didn't agree. The content was too depressing, too politically charged, and too far beyond what executives deemed to be commercially feasible. In boardroom after boardroom, doors slammed shut one by one, and Kirk's dream died in silence. Michael came forward in the early 1970s when the project had stagnated and the rights were still held. At the age of 28, he had no experience producing movies and was still best known for his role as Inspector Keller in a television drama. He approached his father to request the rights. Kirk's response was blunt. The industry had previously expressed its disapproval of this film. Michael nevertheless persisted. He had an unwavering faith in the narrative that transcended reason and tact. In college, he had fallen in love with Kesey's book because its themes of individual revolt and institutional control resonated with the spirit of the counterculture he had personally experienced in Santa Barbara. He just said to his father, "Let me run with this." Kirk gave in, and the next 2 years were spent relentlessly pursuing an industry that remained incredibly doubtful. Michael eventually secured co-producer Saul Zaentz, a wealthy Berkeley record producer who shared his passion for the material. Together, they hired Czech filmmaker Milos Forman, who had experienced the actual weight of institutional persecution in communist Czechoslovakia. Forman provided an authenticity to the film that no American director could have created. Using real patients as extras, production started in the Oregon State Hospital in Salem, giving the movie a raw documentary quality that still unnerves viewers 50 years later. Then came the moment that nearly caused the Douglas family to fall apart forever. When Kirk realized that the lead role, the role he had owned on Broadway, the role he had always imagined would ultimately be his on cinema, had been offered to Jack Nicholson. He was caught off guard. He felt deceived by his own son, not by Hollywood. One of the hardest talks of Michael's life, he would later remember, was breaking the news. He knew just what that meant to his dad. How rare it is for an actor to land a fantastic role in their lifetime. And how Kirk had dreamed of this one for longer than Michael had been an adult. The strain between them was genuine and severe, a wound that took years to entirely heal. However, when the movie was released in November 1975, it caused a stir in Hollywood unlike anything the business had seen in 40 years. Only 2 movies in history have won all 5 major Academy Awards, including One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Best Film, Best Director, Nicholson as Best Actor, Louise Fletcher as Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Michael Douglas made it clear to everyone that he was no longer Kirk Douglas's son when he stood on the stage on Oscar night and claimed the prize. He was a powerful individual. Kirk got more money from that movie than he ever starred in, so he ridiculed his father for years afterward. He would later confess with a calm honesty that said volumes. Even while the breach had been unpleasant, it had served its purpose as the discomfort gradually turned into warmth. Michael had demonstrated a crucial point, nor to his father, nor to Hollywood, but to himself. Everything changed after the Oscar, but it didn't prepare him for what followed. Because the guy who had just revolutionized Hollywood as a producer was about to realize that his greatest performance, the one that would define his generation as a whole, was still to come. Furthermore, it wouldn't come from behind the camera. Decades later, people would still mistake the actor for the role because of the character's moral ferocity and flawless distillation. With Romancing the Stone, a roguish adventure starring Kathleen Turner and Danny DeVito that made over $100 million worldwide and demonstrated for the first time that he could carry a film not as a producer, but as a star. Michael Douglas took his first real stride as a leading man in 1984. In 1985, The Jewel of the Nile came next. The momentum was growing, but in 1987, filmmaker Oliver Stone, who had not even wanted him at first, made the movie that would change him forever. Warren Beatty had been lobbied for by the studio. Richard Gere was what Stone had desired. They both passed. Gordon Gekko was created from the ground up by Michael Douglas. The merciless Wall Street corporate raider whose claim that greed is good became the catchphrase of a decade of American excess. Early in the filmmaking process, Stone tested his star by entering his trailer and accusing him of acting like a novice. A purposeful prod meant to elicit whatever Douglas was suppressing. It was successful. Michael summoned something beyond technique, stung and focused. He directed the pent-up rage of a guy who had been undervalued all his life. Gekko evolved to become a cultural phenomenon rather than merely a performance. He was subsequently ranked as the 24th best villain in movie history by the American Film Institute. Among the 100 best movie phrases ever uttered on screen, this line came in at number 57. Michael Douglas won Best Actor for Wall Street at the 1988 Academy Awards. His pay instantly increased from $2 million per film to $15 million. At 43, he was at the pinnacle of Hollywood. He portrayed an adulterous husband who is stalked by Glenn Close in the same year's Fatal Attraction, which made $317 million worldwide and became one of the decade's most talked-about movies. Basic Instinct, a controversial and provocative film that made $260 million worldwide in 1992, pushed such boundaries even farther. However, behind the gleaming trophies and skyrocketing box office receipts, Michael Douglas was quietly suffering a price that no ceremony acknowledged. His marriage to Dandra Lucer, whom he had married in 1977, was deteriorating due to a demanding work that left nothing for the house. Cameron, their son, was born in 1978, a youngster who experienced the unique loneliness of growing up in a home where his famous father was constantly absent, either physically or mentally. The exact similarities to Michael's own upbringing were devastating. A son yearning for presence, a father who was far away and well-known, and a gap that was expanded rather than filled by celebrity. In 1995, Michael and Dandra went through a formal separation, although their divorce was formalized in 2000, the same year he wed Catherine Zeta-Jones. The legal unraveling of their 23-year marriage would go on for years until it erupted in court in 2010 when Dandra demanded half of Michael's Wall Street riches. He played Gordon Gekko again in the follow-up, Money Never Sleeps. Courtroom records exposed the case. How entirely the normal texture of a marriage has been supplanted by fame and wealth. He had established an empire. A whole generation of stockbrokers actually adored the villain he had built, mistaking the warning for a template. He had received every award the business had to offer, and the price of it was slowly mounting at the one location that was out of the spotlight. In his son's life, a different kind of darkness had already started to emerge. There is a brutality specific to celebrity, the kind that subtly steals the everyday moments that bind a family together while rewarding a man's ambition with prizes. Michael Douglas had chased his father's shadow for 20 years, committed to creating something that solely had his name, signature, and decisions on it. He had achieved unprecedented success. However, in doing so, he had painfully duplicated the same wound that had characterized his own upbringing. In December 1978, Cameron Kirk Douglas was born, the firstborn son of Michael and Deandra, a youngster who arrived into a household already straining under the weight of one of Hollywood's most rigorous careers. Cameron was a contradictory child from the start. Growing up in an exceptionally privileged environment, I experienced a certain type of loneliness that neither celebrity nor wealth could alleviate. His father was often away. Even when he was physically present, his mind was usually elsewhere, engrossed in negotiations, screenplays, and the never-ending machinery of sustaining a career at the top of the industry. His mother was too young and unprepared for a marriage that was already subtly failing. Later on, Cameron would painfully describe his early years. As a child, he was searching for his place in the world and gravitated toward the children who provided the most basic sense of acceptance. At 13, the pattern started. He had advanced by the age of 15. He had gone much farther by the age of 17. By the time he was in his 20s, Cameron Douglas, the grandson of Kirk Douglas, the son of Michael Douglas, the heir to one of the most illustrious dynasties in Hollywood, was dealing methamphetamine and carrying a gun in Manhattan to support addictions that had taken over his life. He experienced convulsions brought on by drugs. Friends observed his decline. His family attempted interventions, but they were met with anger and silence. In the one role that counted most, Michael Douglas, the man who had confronted Oliver Stone's provocations on a movie set and turned that encounter into an Oscar-winning performance, was completely helpless. He would later sit beside his adult son in a nationally broadcast interview with journalist Diane Sawyer and speak with a rawness that no rehearsed statement could have generated. He said, "You rack your brain. At first, you take it personally. You begin to blame yourself. Then, with the unique candor of a guy who has sat with the decision for years, my career took precedence over my family. My marriage wasn't really good. You do then conceal yourself in your work. I ought to have given my family more attention. But when you are in the middle of a career, it is difficult to express that. In your own thoughts, you are attempting to establish a life of your own by emerging from your father's shadow." The Douglas family tragedy encompassed 3 generations of architecture. The son of poor Russian immigrants, Kirk Douglas had been a mostly absent parent, yet had built himself from nothing to become a superstar. The legend's son, Michael Douglas, had lived his entire life avoiding the shadow of that absence, becoming into an absent father in the process. And Cameron, the son of Michael, had grown up in the peculiar loneliness of a boy whose father's face was on movie posters in every city in the world, except the one where Cameron wanted him to be. Michael allegedly hired two guys to forcibly remove Cameron from his surroundings and transport him to a treatment center when he was at his most desperate. Deeply consumed by his addiction, Cameron was violent and the mission fell apart. The split between father and son in the aftermath was significant. They ceased their conversation. They were silent for a long time, and it seemed to last forever. Later on, Michael would confess that he had reached a point where he was no longer willing to emotionally commit to his son, his voice wobbly with anguish. It was an ache he could no longer bear, not cruelty.